Okay, so we are finally getting back into the Abyss storyline from Joshua Williamson's Batman because it just finished, right? In the first video that we did, we basically covered this idea of like the return of Batman Incorporated. For those of you guys who don't know what that meant, the long story being short is basically Batman took like the Batman concept worldwide and just set up like different Batman teams in different parts of the world, some of which were rolled over into the main family in Gotham City, others just kind of continued on out there. It was really just based on the popularity of the character when DC introduced those individuals. But essentially what had happened is that something had gone on where Batman Incorporated, right, these people out there, where they had essentially killed a guy by the name of Abyss. And so the result of this is that Batman is currently investigating it, only to find out that because he had basically lost his fortune due to the events of the Joker War and Joker and basically Punchline essentially taking all his money, that Batman Incorporated had basically lost their funding as well, only to turn around and find themselves funded by Lex Luthor. And so that's where we are here at the moment, where basically Batman and Lex Luthor are essentially meeting, and we're sort of learning what's going on behind the scenes, that Lex Luthor was funding Batman Incorporated. And so that's kind of the funny thing, is that Lex Luthor really seems to be pretty legal here, right? In the sense that he's like, I'm cooperating with law enforcement. I fully support them and this city, right? Like I'm basically a legit guy. Now this is done from the perspective in that following his experiences where he had basically been like a version of Superman, albeit one that was technologically based, where he had actually been Darkseid at one point in time, that if you guys recall the events of like Forever Evil, when essentially the crime syndicate invaded the Earth and that all the superheroes were essentially captured, and Lex Luthor had to basically bring together villains in order to turn them into heroes in order to basically save the world and the heroes themselves, that he's had a lot of lessons over the course of this time. And one of those lessons is that he essentially has turned over a new leaf, right? He's basically gone legit. But in the middle of this meeting, of course, you end up having the cops who show up, they realize it's a Batman and they just open fire, right? It's really just kind of like this kill on sight order. Now, of course, Bruce Wayne basically throws down a smoke bomb and essentially everybody ends up, basically, blinded and whatnot. And then he essentially preserves the crime scene. And like, that's basically it, right? Everything's kind of sorted. And so following that, you basically switch up with Lex Luthor inviting Bruce Wayne to dinner. Now, one of the things to remember is Lex Luthor knows Bruce Wayne's Batman and he's known for a very long time, right? That's not really a relatively new thing. But he kind of tells this bit of a story about a bottle of wine and how expensive it is and kind of pours it out. It's not really a necessary thing. What is important here is he says, I know you're broke. Like, I know you lost everything financially. I'm currently funding Batman Incorporated. Let me fund you. Like, in effect, he's giving Batman a job offer, right? He's like, come and work for me. Like, work for me as Batman. You'll stay in Gotham City. You'll do your thing. You can run it however you want to, but I'll be the financier, right? I'll be the one to financially back you. Of course, it also pisses him off. But it's one of these things where Bruce Wayne just doesn't trust Lex Luthor, where like, no matter what goes on, that regardless of what kind of perception he puts on, that Lex Luthor is always involved in some shady stuff, right? There's always something that's just not right here. And so what you end up getting is basically this body of Abyss that's being examined by Batman, and at the same time is supposed to be in the morgue. Now, what ends up happening is, of course, the body that was left in the morgue was basically a decoy, right? Like what happens is it seems like Bruce Wayne has his hands on the actual body of Abyss, but then suddenly everything starts going dark. Batman goes to throw some flashbangs to try to bring in some light, but essentially everything's just kind of darkened out, and none of his lights really seem, or none of his tools seem to work, right? Night vision, infrared, none of it works. But that's when he's met by the arrival of Abyss, right? He can see himself, he just can't see anything else around him. And so in that moment, that's when he realizes, okay, so like Abyss is here, right? He's like, Abyss is a guy who's actually alive. This body is a fake body. He picked up on that pretty fast because Abyss was killed not too long ago. This body is a person who's basically been decaying for a couple months, so the timetables just simply don't add up. But he's kind of like, okay, cool. So like, it's kind of one of those Dark Knight Rises kind of things, like, you adopted the dog, that kind of a thing, right? Where he's like, look, I'm Batman, I fight in the dark. So having darkness here is not going to do you any good. The thing about this though, is that Abyss is, he's not your average bear. This is not just some average guy using the darkness to his own tools. Instead, he kind of taunts him to a degree. When Batman asks him like, who are you? He's like, I'm a creature of the darkness, right? Born in the shadows, just like you. And he's like, the voices in the dark are my only master. I don't work for Lex Luthor, because that's the initial response to the question of Bruce Wayne is, how are you involved with Lex Luthor? Like, do you work for him? And so ultimately, he actually ends up managing to overcome Batman. And the reason for this is because he's fast and he's silent. he's almost ninja in nature, and is really something that Batman hasn't seemed to counter before. More so than that, it's not simply an attack on Bruce Wayne. That what happens is because of the scythe he's using and the way he's able to injure Bruce Wayne, he basically blinds him, right? He leaves Bruce Wayne blinded. And that's literally one of the things, right? Like this cop he's been working with, she comes running up on him. She's like, look, we got to get out of here, right? The whole building's getting ready to go on lockdown. We have to get out of here now. And he says, I can't, right? Everything is too dark. That he has in effect lost his sight as a result of the actions or the injury that was done to him by Abyss, right? That Abyss has some kind of tool at his disposal when it comes to this stuff. Now, the first thing Batman has to do here is figure out how to reverse this blindness, right? It's the first thing he has to do. Figure out how to get this blindness removed and how to essentially regain his ability to see. And he was just like, you know, as far as I can tell, there's no real way to do this, but I need to get to a place that's dark. I need to get to a place where I can basically operate without anybody knowing who I am or anybody being able to see me, and that even includes the cop herself, right? So of course, they end up going to her apartment, which is kind of a weird place. Abyss also catches up to Lex Luthor, which is something that happens. We don't really get a whole lot here. We basically just get him like powering up this Batman suit, which really looks amazing, right? Like Lex Luthor essentially becomes Batman, which is pretty legit. But the thing about this is that Lex Luthor is not on the same level as Bruce Wayne when it comes to like fighting and when it comes to just tactics and so on. So he is seemingly overcome by Abyss pretty fast, right? We don't see what happens. We just see the two of them engage in a fight, and that's seemingly it. The other thing here is that ultimately Bruce Wayne can't really seem to find a way to heal his eyesight. And so he's ultimately just kind of stuck there being blind. And so he says, okay, fine. Then the next thing we have to do here is get a hold of Batman Incorporated. We have to find out why the body in the morgue was a decoy, right? Like there's something bigger going on here, and they know what's going on, right? Like we have to know why they went after Abyss. They have all the answers to the questions that we have. And so one of the things that this detective says is like, look, Lex Luthor funds all the prisons, right? State-of-the-art security, all that kind of stuff. And the warden who runs it is in no doubt trying to make sure that he stays in Lex Luthor's good graces. So what's likely going to happen to your members of Batman Incorporated is they're all going to be shuffled off to solitary confinement, right? 23-hour lockdown, if not 24-hour lockdown, just kind of, you know, consistently. You're never going to be able to get to them. The only way to access them is when they're being transferred. And that's exactly what happens. That Batman basically catches up to them as they're all being transferred to solitary confinement, takes out all the lights, and where they initially think it's Abyss due to the fact that they've encountered Abyss before, and this whole scenario unfolds the same way, Batman appears and says, no, this is my move, right? And initially he tells them like, get to the roof. Like you need to get to the roof and we need to have a discussion. The response to them is, no, that's not going to happen. They basically turn against Batman, right? Like he's like, look, I know you guys are all innocent. I know what's going on with Abyss, or at least I seem to have some idea with Abyss. I know he's not dead, right? That means you all didn't kill him. We need to go talk. And where it's kind of like where they ask him like, why are you talking weird? That kind of a thing, where he seems a little off kilter, seems a little strange. At the end of the day, he starts kind of interrogating them, right? Treating them almost like people he doesn't trust, right? He's like, at least tell me how Lex Luthor's involved with Batman Incorporated. Why would you work for someone like him? Is it the money? And the reality here is the reason why Batman Incorporated was formed, or at least the reason why these individuals were chosen, is because money is not their god. They don't pursue money. It's not the thing they're looking for. They're not mercenaries. They do what they do because they legitimately believe that it's the right thing to do. And so because of that, they're just kind of like, no, you know, they almost kind of take offense to it. You know, it was like Lex Luthor gave us more than money. He gave us a mission. And then when Batman asked like, what mission was Lex Luthor give you? They're like, why do you care? Right? Like we didn't need you before and we don't need you now. And they ultimately end up attacking him, right? Like Batman has to fight his own organization, right? Batman versus Batman Incorporated. And it's cool to see because he is able to overcome them to a degree. Like the cop who's in his earpiece talking to him is trying to tell him what to do. And he's like, stop, right? Like you're a distraction. You know, Batman focusing on his sound or focusing on his hearing is able to basically pick up where each one of these guys are coming from and is able to counter them accordingly, but just really kind of lashes out here, right? Like talk to me, right? Why would you work with Lex Luthor, a Batman that's that shady? But then suddenly the cops basically come out of nowhere and then there's like, let's get to the roof, right? They basically take off. Once they arrive up on the rooftop, of course, him being surrounded, Lex Luthor arrives on the scene. And that's when, of course, we end up finding one, Lex Luthor survived, and two, seemingly Lex Luthor is not blind. At the same time that happens, you end up having Abyss who arrives on the scene as well. And ultimately what Lex Luthor says here is the only possible way for you to stop Abyss is to basically come with me, right? Like you have to work for me. I can provide provide you the tools, the assets, the things that you need. It's very, very cryptic and it's very weird because what it looks like is Lex Luthor has essentially set all this up. And the response of Batman is like, what games are you playing, right? What did you do? How are you involved in this? But ultimately, the members of Batman Incorporated chime in and say, like, you don't understand it, Batman. Like, you don't get what's going on. Lex Luthor may very well have funded our whole Batman Incorporated situation here following you losing all your money, but Abyss is our leader. And that's where Abyss says, join us in the dark, Batman, and help us kill Lex Luthor, right? Help us turn against this guy and destroy him. That's their mission. That's their secret mission, is to kill Lex Luthor. And the crazy thing about this is that as the fight breaks out and as initially Batman begins to join Lex Luthor, the two of them fighting side by side against Abyss and Batman Incorporated, you of course end up finding out that this police officer working alongside with Batman is calling backup and it's like the cops are coming and all that kind of stuff. And ultimately Abyss is like, excellent, right? Like, if you provided an audience, we can provide the show. And he's like, Batman Incorporated, prove your loyalty, kill Lex Luthor. And so the fight breaks out and it's pretty intense, right? This is a pretty extreme fight. And it's just one of those things where literally Lex Luthor points out that Batman's blind. And everybody's like, wait a minute, what? Like Batman's blind right now? Like, what? Hold on. Like, what in the hell? Like, Lex Luthor says, okay, like, I prepared myself for this fight. Batman says, one of the members of Batman Incorporated says, like, look, I'm sorry that it came down to this, Batman. And the response of Bruce is, don't be. And he says, Batman Incorporated, code Club of Heroes. And essentially, depending on how you feel about it, it was all an undercover operation. I feel like Joshua Williamson wrote himself into a corner here. That what's basically going on, or what basically seemed to have been going on, is that Batman Incorporated have been working with Batman the entire time. That the reality is that they were all kind of working together to basically bring out Abyss, to trick Abyss into believing that he had the upper hand, only to find out that he didn't. And ultimately, the thing about Abyss is he's able to take them all out, essentially single-handedly. The other thing that goes on here is that Abyss says, we all want to be Batman, right? No longer a victim. Then Lex Luthor came to me with an offer, Bruce Wayne, the tools to become a new kind of Batman and the training. But I was just the start of Lex's experiment. He thought he could find cities full of crime and create his own Batman, one that was loyal to him. But then he abandoned me, left me to show this city how scary it can be in the dark. Lex knew his little experiment got away from him and sent a whole team of Batmen to stop me. That in essence, Lex Luthor was the one that caused all of this. That the way this timeline seems to have played out is that with the absence of Batman being able to fund Batman Incorporated and knowing that the loyalties of Batman Incorporated were not to the highest bidder, that what Lex Luthor saw was an opportunity to basically use experimentation, right? Probably gene modification or something like that, to basically create a new kind of Batman and then use this guy Abyss as what's basically a test subject. For reasons that aren't necessarily explained here, Lex Luthor abandoned the whole idea of Abyss. Now, it may be one of these things where this is all what happened in the early days of Batman Incorporated, and that it doesn't really seem to have been involved in anything recent. That Lex Luthor abandoning what was going on with Abyss and abandoning creating his own Batman in different cities, kind of his own version, quote unquote, of Batman Incorporated, that was all abandoned because of the fact that he basically turned over a new leaf. And that what Abyss is experiencing here is basically rejection, right? Like, he's angry because he felt rejected by Lex Luthor. Whatever the case happens to be, that ultimately Lex essentially created this whole thing, and that the operation was to basically find Abyss, bring him out, and then ultimately capture him. Now, one of the things here is that the nature of quote unquote this undercover operation, that while Batman is the one pulling the strings, it didn't necessarily seem to be something that they had worked out ahead of time. What was going on here is that Batman Incorporated was basically being loyal to Batman himself, right? And we'll kind of talk about why here in a second, that they displayed this loyalty in a way that Batman would understand. But ultimately, Batman basically ends up grabbing the suit of Lex Luthor because that seems to be the thing that protected him and kept him from going blind, indicating that the ability of Abyss to make Batman go blind is technologically based. So ultimately, using the technology in Luthor's suit, Batman undoes his own blindness and then in turn tracks down Abyss and literally just pummels him, right? Like using a combination of his own technology to basically create what is in effect a kind of white room, a place where Abyss can't hide in the shadows. There's nowhere for him to go. That is about as fair of a fight as it can possibly be. And Batman overcomes him swiftly, right? Exceedingly fast. Like, it's just one of those things where Abyss never really had a chance in the first place. But ultimately, when Batman overcomes him, he essentially tells Abyss that he had lost sight of Batman Incorporated, right? That Lex Luthor had essentially preyed on that. And he says, I didn't make you, but I can still help you. And Abyss says, I only wanted to be like you, Batman. Instead, I'm always in the dark. And he says, forever. And he ultimately ends up throwing down a kind of bomb that just shrouds the entire area in darkness, and then ultimately makes his escape. And Batman, with no choice, ultimately ends up leaving and going back to visit with the rest of Batman Incorporated. Now, this is where we kind of get what was going on, is the sense that Batman Incorporated was always loyal to Batman. There was never really an instance when they had actually sided with Lex Luthor. If anything, them siding with Lex Luthor was them kind of conducting their own investigation to a degree to find out how Lex Luthor and Abyss were basically connected. And that once they were caught, they ultimately knew Batman would catch up with them and Batman would continue the investigation where they had essentially left off. And so when ultimately they're like, I mean, like, how did you know that we were basically working with you, right? When they kind of, when they ultimately abandoned Lex and Lex is back to doing his own thing and doesn't really have his own Batman Incorporated, when they're like, how did you know that we were on your side? Batman says, because when we were in the prison, you guys are all amazing fighters. It's one of the reasons why I have you here is Batman Incorporated. And when you guys attacked me, it was obvious you were holding back. You were pulling your punches because you knew that Abyss was watching you. Like, you knew that's what was going on. They were using just essentially fighting styles and body language to communicate with Batman that, hey man, we're on your side here. You just need to be aware of the fact that we're doing this to essentially put on a show. Now, this is a very, very important thing because what it speaks to is, one, how well Batman and the other members of Batman Incorporated know each other, but two, the training that went into them operating as a team that knows how to communicate with Batman. Because it's not one of those things where, like, if they knew Abyss was watching, they could like punch him, they could kick him, and then whisper stuff in his ear while they're doing it, like, Abyss is watching, you know, and then like that kind of a thing. They couldn't necessarily do that. It had to look real, right? Because Abyss is very, very capable, and he would have picked up on that almost instantaneously. Like, he would have realized, okay, they're alerting Batman to what's going on in terms of all this stuff. And so ultimately, when Bruce asked them, like, why didn't you call me for help, right? Why didn't you hit me up and let me know what was going on? Their response is, would you have done the same thing, right? Communication is a two-way street, home slice. Would you have talked to us, right? Is that something that you would have done? And where he's just kind of like, I probably wouldn't have. And he's like, good job, guys. I'll be in touch, right? I'm needed elsewhere. You guys continue on, do your thing. Great job. Awesome. Okay, cool. Peace. And then like basically bails, basically takes off. Now we do get a couple epilogues here. One of them is that he contacts Ghostmaker, if you guys recall him, and says like, I need you to keep an eye on something for me, but we don't necessarily find out exactly what's going on, right? There is the Batman annual for 2022, but that doesn't go on sale until the end of May. So we won't know exactly what's going on until then. You do end up having this cop that it basically investigates LexCorp and then kind of asks the question what Lex Luthor was really up to. The big takeaway from all this is that Prometheus is basically speaking to an unnamed person and saying, our people have confirmed that Batman has returned to Gotham City. And this unnamed person says, make sure my secret society monitors his movements, right? This secret society of supervillains. Now, Prometheus himself is basically a guy with the helmet he wears. It allows him to essentially analyze and then understand the movements of people he's fighting against. So think of him like a technological version of Taskmaster for those of you guys who are coming from Marvel Comics. But the person he's speaking to is basically King Deathstroke. That Deathstroke has reformed the secret society of supervillains and that he intends to launch a shadow war against Batman, which I'm really excited to see what that looks like. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this to an end. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.